All right, good evening and welcome to PastForward's first ever virtual tour where women made history coast to coast. I'm your host, Amy Webb, and I'm a Senior Field Director for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We hope you've been enjoying the conference today, and I know there's a lot more to come over the next 2 days. But for now, please settle back and relax as we take you on a virtual cross-country trip for the next 60 minutes. Tonight, we'll be traveling from Washington State to Washington, D.C. to bring you the stories of several remarkable women: a Native American human rights and social justice activist, a Hispano community leader and philanthropist, an African American folk artist and cultural anthropologist, and for our final stop, the stories of women's suffrage activists who worked toward the creation of the 19th Amendment a little over 100 years ago. If you have any questions during our virtual tour, all of our co-hosts who are here with us tonight will do their best to answer them. Just please type your questions in down below. Our first stop on the tour is Fort Vancouver National Historic Site in Vancouver, Washington, just north of Portland, Oregon. Here you'll learn more about Sarah Winnemucca, a Northern Paiute author, activist, and educator. Our guide for this portion of the tour will be Megan Huff. Welcome, Megan. And Megan is the curator at Fort Vancouver National Historic Site. She's worked at Fort Vancouver since 2010, and we're delighted to have you with us. Megan, before we start your portion of the tour, can you tell us what interests you most about your work at Fort Vancouver National Historic Site?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. The thing that interests me most about working at Fort Vancouver is the fact that I get to research history for a living. That's always sort of a pinch myself, very cool thing about my job. And I get to tell these amazing stories. And I guess I sort of see myself in a long line of people who will get to tell these stories throughout time, since national parks are forever. And I just feel very lucky that I get to do this.
Yeah. Well, Megan, I know, obviously with the pandemic that has put a crinkle in the operations of a lot of historic sites across the country. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's happening at Fort Vancouver today? Is the site currently open to the public?
Sure. So we have a large grounds and green space and trails, which have been open throughout the pandemic. We're an urban national park. We're located in Vancouver, Washington. So, lots of people, especially people who need to get out of the house, have really been using the park as a good place to walk around and have picnics and play and that kind of thing. And then just this fall, we've been slowly reopening our facilities. So we have Fort Vancouver, which is a reconstructed British fur trade fort, which is now open. Pearson Air Museum, which tells the story of early aviation in Vancouver, is now open, and our visitor center is open now as well.
Great. Well, Megan, I was so fascinated about Sarah when you were telling me this story, and I think all of our guests tonight are going to be equally interested. And so let's go ahead and go to your virtual tour.
Hello and welcome to Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, located in beautiful Vancouver, Washington and Oregon City, Oregon. My name is Megan Huff and I am the museum curator here at this national park. Today I'm at Vancouver Barracks, which is one of the oldest military posts in the Pacific Northwest, where we will talk about a woman who worked tirelessly to help her people and Native people who were imprisoned here, Paiute author and activist Sarah Winnemucca. Sarah was born around 1844 in what is now the state of Nevada. She was a Paiute woman, the daughter of Chief Winnemucca. From the time she was a young girl, Sarah and her family both witnessed and were the victims of acts of violence and injustice perpetrated on the Paiute people by the United States military, civilian settlers, and Indian agents charged with managing reservations. Sarah longed to help her people, and she recognized early on that language and communication were essential starting points to bringing about fair treatment. For many years, Sarah worked as an interpreter. As she later wrote, "My people are very reasonable and want to understand everything and be sure that there is fair play." Sarah interpreted for the Paiute at the Mahler Reservation in eastern Oregon until her protests against the corrupt Indian agent there forced her to leave. When Sarah first arrived here at Vancouver Barracks in November 1879, she had recently worked for General Oliver Otis Howard as a scout and interpreter during the war between the United States and the Bannock. Sarah had greatly impressed General Howard and the other Army officers with her loyalty, bravery, and skill. During the war, Sarah saw her work as part of an important effort to keep peace between the United States and the Paiute. General Howard was a famed Civil War general who was then serving as the commander of the Army's Department of the Columbia and living in this ornate home he had just built that year. Here, Sarah asked Howard to send help to the Paiute who had been sent to live on the Yakima Reservation in central Washington. Though many of the Paiute had cooperated with the military during the war with the Bannock, some had joined the Bannock's forces, and Sarah believed they were being unfairly punished. The Paiute had been forced to make the 350-mile journey from the Malheur Reservation to the Yakima Reservation in the middle of the previous winter, resulting in many deaths. Once they had arrived, they were forced to live without basic necessities, again at the mercy of an unsympathetic Indian agent. After this visit to Vancouver Barracks, Sarah needed to find a larger audience for her message. From here, she went to San Francisco, where she delivered a series of popular lectures on behalf of the Paiute. From San Francisco, she went to Washington, D.C. with her father and her brother, and there they met with the Secretary of the Interior and President Rutherford B. Hayes. However, despite the promises made by the U.S. government on that trip, the Paiute people living on the Yakima Reservation were still not given what they needed, a safe way back to their homelands. In 1881, when she was running low on funds, Sarah wrote to General Howard here and asked if he had a position for her. He asked her to come here and act as an interpreter for Native people who were imprisoned in the Vancouver Barracks guardhouse. Throughout the Indian Wars of the late 1800s, the guardhouse was used as a place to hold Native men, women, and children who had been taken prisoner. General Howard believed that keeping Native people imprisoned at the guardhouse, especially high-profile tribal members, could be used as an incentive to force the cooperation of tribal leaders who resisted removal to reservations. When Sarah arrived here in 1881, 13 men, 21 women, and 19 children were imprisoned at the guardhouse. Many were living in tents in the surrounding area in all weather. The guardhouse is no longer standing, but it would have been located about here. It faced this enormous garrison flagpole, a huge parade ground, and beyond that, Officers' Row and the post commander's residence. Soldiers who had broken Army laws or regulations were also held here. The guardhouse was in a highly visible location, and it was an important symbol of the Army's power and control here. For the people imprisoned at Vancouver Barracks in 1881, a group that included Sheep-Eater Shoshone, Bannock, Paiute, Nez Perce, Snake, and Cayuse people, Sarah worked as an interpreter and also organized classes to teach the imprisoned children English. Imprisoned men were forced to make improvements to the Army post. They whitewashed fences, made paths, built and improved roads, and, as General Howard later wrote, put the whole outer face of things in prime condition. One of these imprisoned men, however, took 2 others with him and escaped across the Columbia River and into Oregon. Sarah and a group of officers' wives offered imprisoned women lessons in sewing. Sunday school was also offered and may have taken place in the upstairs chapel of the guardhouse. General Howard later called the imprisonment of this group of Native people the most satisfactory operation, and called this period of imprisonment an opportunity to apply the processes of civilization. In March 1881, Sarah wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Interior on behalf of the imprisoned people at Vancouver Barracks, telling him that they needed better supplies and clothing and a proper place to live in. She asked that he give them some land in the area where she could teach them to farm, rather than relocating them to a reservation. While she was at Vancouver Barracks, President Hayes visited, and again Sarah had the opportunity to speak with him and First Lady Lucy Hayes. She told them about the suffering of the Paiute on the Yakima Reservation, and her story brought the First Lady to tears. But while President Hayes offered to look into the matter, again, no progress was made. By the end of 1881, Sarah's request to let the Native people imprisoned at Vancouver Barracks stay in Washington was denied, and she helped escort them to the Fort Hall Reservation in Idaho. Sarah went on to deliver hundreds of lectures in the eastern United States on behalf of the Paiute. In 1883, she published her autobiography, the first book of its kind written by a Native woman. Through Sarah's writing and lectures, the world learned about the experience of westward expansion from the perspective of the people who were already here when settlers moved in. She told the stories of Native women and children, stories that were often ignored, overlooked, or filtered by white writers. And through her speeches and writings, she argued against the Indian agency system that both manipulated and ignored her people. The stories she told were moving and pointed calls to action. At the end of her book, Life Among the Paiutes, there were instructions for readers to create a petition on behalf of the Paiutes and even an address where they could send the signatures they had collected. Advocating for her people was Sarah Winnemucca's life's work. As she herself said, "I am going to see my people dealt rightly by, and to stand by them, and I am going to talk for them just as long as I live. I am here to work for my people, and I am going to my work." Thank you so much for joining me on this virtual trip to Fort Vancouver, and we hope to see you here in person soon.
Thanks for that tour, Megan. If anyone has any questions for Megan about the tour, please go ahead and type them in below, and we'll do our best to reply to as many of those as we can. Megan, it's so interesting and inspiring to me to learn about Sarah, a Native American woman who was working for the U.S. Army, but at the same time fighting for the rights of imprisoned Native Americans some 140 years ago. How unusual was it to have a Native American woman doing something like that at that time? I mean, to me, that sounds pretty gutsy.
Yes, absolutely. She was a very gutsy woman. And actually, she was not the only Paiute woman doing this exact same work at this exact same time. She was working during the war with the Bannock. She was working alongside her sister-in-law, Maddie, who unfortunately died shortly after the end of that war, and then Sarah carried on. In terms of her working with the Army, she was really doing things, especially during the Bannock War, that other soldiers were not willing to do because it was hard or difficult, or they just didn't have the knowledge for these missions. And she was willing to do these things and to go scout locations and do interpretation work and things like that. And part of it is because she had such a personal stake in this war, because the outcome of the war was really the outcome for her family, for her people, for her loved ones, for everyone she knew. So for her, I think she really saw working with the Army as a way that she could shape the outcome of what was going to happen to her people at the end of the Bannock War, which unfortunately ended up being the removal to the Yakima Reservation. And at that point is when she really sort of took off and went to San Francisco and decided to really start speaking out on their behalf.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I have to say, I had not heard of Sarah Winnemucca before we had this conversation. And I'm just curious whether there are other historical sites associated with Sarah's story, or, is Fort Vancouver the only place, Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, the only place you can go to learn more about her?
I hope not. I'm sure there are other historical societies and museums in Nevada. There is a tribal museum at Pyramid Lake, which is where she spent the early years of her life. So, you can see the landscape that she would have known and go to that museum there. And then also in Oregon, we have the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, which is more focused on wildlife in terms of their visitors to the museum, but it's another place where you can sort of see the landscape that she would have known.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Megan. I really appreciate your time and the tour. We're now going to be leaving Vancouver, Washington, and we're going to be heading down to Trinidad, Colorado. We'll be joined now by Al Melton. Welcome, Al.
Hello.
And just for context, I'm actually based in Denver, Colorado. So Trinidad is about a 3-hour drive south of where I live. And Trinidad is very close to the Colorado-New Mexico border. We're here tonight with Al to learn more about Dolores Baca and her husband, Felipe, who helped to found the city of Trinidad. Al is the education coordinator at the Trinidad History Museum, which is a community museum of History Colorado, which is part of the state of Colorado's Historical Society. And Al has been there since, is it 2017? Is that right, Al?
Correct.
Great. Okay. So Al, before we begin our tour in Trinidad and learn more about Dolores Baca, can you talk a little bit about this part of the country? In particular, I know that the U.S.-Mexico border has been in the news an awful lot these days. But I also know that back in 1848, our southern border looked a whole lot different than it does today. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Before 1848, this part of Colorado was still part of Mexico. The border at the time between Mexico and the United States was the Arkansas River, or the Rio Nepesta, which runs through Pueblo, Colorado, about an hour north of here. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. gained nearly 1 million square miles of land. This includes California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada, and also parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So a massive amount of land we got from that treaty.
Yeah. Okay. So Southern Colorado wasn't part of the U.S. until about 1848, and the Bacas came to this area in the 1860s. So that's just 20 years later, and of course that was before Colorado became a state, which wasn't until 1876. What was it like in this part of Colorado back then?
Well, you already had Hispanos living in parts of Colorado, including places like San Luis, which is located in the San Luis Valley west of Trinidad. It's Colorado's oldest continuously inhabited town, which was founded in 1851. The Trinidad area was not permanently inhabited at the time. Indigenous people, including the Clovis thousands of years ago, and more recently, the Hickory Apache and Mountain Ute, used the Purgatory River Valley as a meeting grounds. And of course, you also had people traveling along the river and over the Raton Pass as part of the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail.
So before we go to the tour, my last question is, why Trinidad? Why would the Bacas want to donate land to create a settlement there in that particular spot?
Well, I think if you were to walk around Trinidad today, you'd see the reasons why. I might be a little biased, but it's beautiful here. You have Fisher's Peak as the backdrop of the town, which is the highest point of elevation east of the Rockies in the United States. Fun fact. But we're also nestled right in the Purgatory River Valley. The Purgatory River runs through here. So the area around the river would have been fertile and ideal for ranching and agriculture. And ultimately, I believe Dolores and Felipe saw the value in the area and this community and wanted to give an opportunity for Trinidad to flourish.
Great. Okay, well, let's join Al in Trinidad, Colorado to tour the Baca House and learn more about Dolores Baca and her husband, Felipe.
Trinidad, Colorado is located 15 miles north of the New Mexico border in the Purgatory River Valley, along the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail. The Trinidad History Museum is situated in the heart of downtown Trinidad, along a section of Main Street that was known as Millionaire's Row because of buildings like this one. The house was constructed in 1870 by John Huff, a Santa Fe Trail entrepreneur from Pennsylvania. His roots can be seen in the architectural design, which includes a pitched tin roof, 2 stories, and a widow's walk. The house was built from adobe bricks made of sun-hardened mixture of mud, clay, sand, water, and straw, held together with mud mortar and sealed against the elements with adobe stucco. Felipe and Dolores Baca were one of our town's founding families. Felipe Baca was a teenager when he became a goat and cow herder for his uncle, driving the animals hundreds of miles from New Mexico to Mexico and then back again. When he was 21, he married 18-year-old Dolores, who was born in January 1833 in Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico, which is near Taos. They married in Taos, and in the years following, the couple lived in Agua Negra and Guadalupira, both of which were located in Mora County, New Mexico. The couple began their married life farming in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. In 1859, a 30-year-old Felipe traveled to Denver on business. While on the trip, the Purgatory River caught his attention. Felipe recognized the potential of the land immediately and would return the following spring with teams of men to prepare irrigation and crops for their families to follow. Felipe and Dolores loaded their family and headed north, followed by a caravan of 12 other families. They arrived in 1861 and began to build plazas along the Purgatory River. The Baca family built a large plaza and named it Trinidad, or the Trinity, and built a small church in the plaza for families to gather at a Catholic worship on Sundays. Felipe and Dolores decided to be good friends and neighbors with the Native Americans of the area and grew extra corn to share with local tribes. Dolores Baca famously removed her bright red scarf and gave it to Chief Colora of the Mountain Utes, who fought settlers who came to the area. The legacy of diversity in the town of Trinidad can be traced back to the big hearts and brave souls of the Bacas, who were cool heads of reason that rose above the tension. This room was originally an informal parlor where the family would have spent time together, but we currently have the space interpreted as a wool studio to highlight the importance of sheep ranching for the Baca family and southern Colorado. In 1866, the Bacas donated 75 acres of land to start the town of Trinidad. The Santa Fe Trail ran right through the land they donated. It was frequented by travelers, providing great economic opportunity for other families in the area. The Baca Plaza was now in the middle of town, and the Bacas in Trinidad continued to prosper. In 1873, the Bacas decided to move and began pursuing the Huff House. The Huffs were only in the house for 3 years when the Bacas purchased the property for 22,000 pounds of wool. Felipe remained a leader and influential member of the community, elected as a representative to the territorial legislature. He can be attributed with being one of the Hispanos in the legislature to ensure that the Colorado Constitution would be fair for all citizens, and helped ensure that the state constitution be printed in English and Spanish for the first 25 years of statehood. On the wall there are 2 photographs. One is of the Baca's son, Facundo, and the other is his wife, Isabel. They were the last Bacas to own the property and were the parents of Consuelo, who donated the original pieces of furniture that we have in the house. Facundo and his older brother Felix both attended Notre Dame. Facundo became a physician. Felix was an attorney and later a judge. Their older brother Luis became a civil engineer. The eldest Baca son, Juan Pedro, took over the sheep ranching company from his father and also ran a general store in town. All of the girls were educated except for Gregorita, who unfortunately died as an infant. Dionisia, Catarina, Apollonia, Rosita were all married into other prominent families. Maria de la Luz became the first Sister of Charity from Trinidad, taking the name Sister Mercedes. This is the formal parlor, a room where guests were entertained. Social gatherings, meetings, or parties would have occurred here. This room also houses 2 of our original pieces. The first is a piano and the second is a desk against the wall. These pieces were owned by the Huffs and later by the Bacas. The indoor kitchen would have been used any time it made sense to warm up a home, so primarily in winter, but due to the elevation in Trinidad, snow is possible anywhere between September and May. Thus, the indoor kitchen saw a lot of use throughout the year. The dining room is where the Bacchus would have had their meals. In the corner of the room there is a pie safe that was crafted in Raton, New Mexico, using a technique of rolling or hammering the tin flat, then puncturing to craft designs. This technique and style was very common throughout the Southwest and is still a very popular tradition in New Mexico today. The master bedroom was where Felipe and Dolores would have stayed. Unfortunately, Felipe died a year after moving into the house. He was at his daughter's wedding only 2 days prior, so it was something that occurred unexpectedly. Dolores lived in the house until 1915, when she died at the age of 84. This is why there is black clothing laid out in the room. She reputedly only wore black for the rest of her life, mourning for Felipe. The rest of the rooms on the second floor were children's bedrooms. The Bacchus had 6 children still living at home when they moved into this house, and we have interpreted these rooms for them. The youngest 3 children were Luis, Felix, and Facundo, who were 11, 6, and 4 respectively when their father died. These were the children that later grew up to be a civil engineer, a lawyer and judge, and a physician. With this information, and knowing the Baca daughters were also educated, we can conclude that Dolores highly valued education. She was very religious, charitable, and an astute businesswoman. Following Felipe's death, Dolores handled the finances. In an 1888 letter to his mother, Felix commended her for holding on to property until the selling prices were higher. Mrs. Huff, John Huff's wife, also recalled that Dolores drove a hard bargain when the two discussed the purchase price for the furnishings of the house. After the Bacchus sold the house in the 1930s, it was purchased and became a rooming house for the next 20 years. The Baca House is now part of the Trinidad History Museum. For more information, please visit trinidadhistorymuseum.org. Thank you for watching.
Thanks, Al, for the tour of the Baca House. If anyone has any questions for Al about Dolores Baca or the Baca House, please type them in below and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Al, before we let you go, I'm really struck that Dolores, I mean, here she is, this young widow and a single mother of 6, you did say 6 children, is that correct?
She had 9 in total, but
Oh
3 of them were already adults. 6 of them were still living at home and under 18.
Oh, that's just unbelievable. So she was managing all of these children. She was managing the household. She was running the family business. And yet, she had some of her children grow up. Clearly, education must have been important to her with coming in and taking on careers like becoming a civil engineer and a lawyer and a doctor. It's just very impressive.
Definitely. I think it says a lot about her strength of character, fortitude, and overall determination. I try to imagine myself in that position, and wow, that's beyond words, really. Just
I agree.
You can edit this part, but yeah.
Yeah, very impressive, very impressive. Well, thank you, Al, and thank you for that tour. We're now going to be leaving Colorado and we're going to be heading down south to the Melrose Plantation, which is located on the Cane River in northern Louisiana. Here we're going to learn more about the celebrated African-American folk artist Clementine Hunter, who documented the life of a sharecropper at the turn of the century. And joining us is Molly Baker, who currently works for the National Trust's Hope Crew program, but who came to the Trust from Melrose Plantation. Molly, I understand you learned about Hope Crew and the National Trust through your work at Melrose. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to Melrose Plantation and then on to join us here at the Trust?
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to. Well, my background is in preservation trades. I was completing a degree in the trades and found out about the opportunity at Melrose and was fortunate enough to be selected as their site director in 2013. And my primary role there was to manage cyclical maintenance and execute preservation projects, planning and project management, in addition to general site maintenance or site management. But one of the biggest honors while I was there was the preservation efforts of the building you see over my shoulder, the African House. And it was named a national treasure in 2015 by the National Trust. And it was through the Treasures program that we became aware of the Hope Crew program, a new initiative that the Trust was offering to allow young people to learn preservation trades, an acronym for hands-on preservation experience. And it was by means of that project that we brought a crew of young people in to learn timber framing, and the entire roof framing was addressed during that project, in addition to learning how to do roof cladding application. And the project was an absolute success, and we were just so thrilled with the results. And personally, I kept track of the program after, and it was about 2 years ago, actually this month, that I was honored to join the team.
Great. Well, thank you so much for giving us this tour today. We're going to go now to our virtual tour of the African House at Melrose Plantation. And again, Melrose Plantation is a historic site that's owned and operated by the Association for the Preservation of Historic Natchitoches. And it's also one of, I believe, about 44 sites that are part of the Historic Artist Homes and Studios Coalition. So with that, we will go to Melrose Plantation.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be back at Melrose and to share the remarkable history of this site and also share the folk art of the one and only Clementine Hunter. Melrose Plantation is recognized as a National Landmark Site due to its incredibly varied history that was collected as the property changed hands and the land it's located on went from tribal land to French territory to Spanish territory, back to French territory once again, and since 1803, a part of America. Melrose was founded in 1796 by means of a Spanish land grant. The founder was Louis Metoyer, a Jean de Couleur libre, which is a free Creole of color. However, at the time the land grant was given to Metoyer, he was technically still enslaved under the French Code Noir. It was 2 years later that he and his family earned enough money to purchase him from enslavement. Metoyer's mother, Marie Therese Coincoin, a West African woman who was formerly enslaved, and her partner, Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, a Frenchman, worked to free all 10 of their children from enslavement. The Metoyers went on to become one of the largest landholders on the Cane River, as their descendants still are to this day. As time moved on, the property changed hands, and Louisiana went from being a territory in the Americas to part of the United States of America. And unfortunately, Sioux found themselves embroiled in the Civil War. In an inexplicable turn of events, Melrose, which was now in the hands of a woman named Fanny Herzog, was one of the few properties spared in the Red River Campaign, in which Union armies burnt plantations all along the river. The circumstances surrounding the plantation being spared may be explained by the fact that shortly after the end of the war, Melrose was the home of the first freedmen's school on the Cane River. So possibly Fanny was a Union sympathizer, and if this was true, this was a very brave and no doubt unpopular stance to take in that location and at that period of time. The last family to hold Melrose was the Henry family. The Henrys were the ones that gave Melrose its name, and it was given in honor of a Scottish abbey named Melrose that Sir Walter Scott wrote a famous poem about. When the owner, John Hampton Henry, passed unexpectedly, his wife, Carmelite, better known as Cammie, wasted no time turning Melrose into an artist retreat. She brought the art that she so longed for to her in rural Louisiana by hosting this artist haven. The retreat brought writers, photographers, and painters from far and wide. And unique to this time and place was the fact that most of the invited guests are now known to be part of the early 20th century LGBTQ artist community. Another unique and unrelated fact about the artist retreat is that the most famous artist associated with Melrose was not an invited guest, but rather an employee who midlife decided to try her hand at painting, inspired by the art she saw being created around her and using remnants of discarded tubes of paint that she found. The artist is Clementine Hunter, one of the most prolific and well-known African-American folk artists of the 20th century. Born in 1887, Hunter knew firsthand what it was like to work as a tenant farmer and a sharecropper before mechanized farming reached Louisiana. She paints from memory the scenes of picking pecans and cotton by hand as a child, and paints the scenes of her life as an African-American woman living on the Cane River at the turn of the century. She serves as a cultural anthropologist of sorts, capturing scenes rarely the subject of art at that time. Her largest work of art, seen behind me, is the African House Murals, a set of 9 large paintings that showcase scenes including a river baptism, a funeral procession, a wash day, and even a look inside of a local juke joint on a Saturday night. I invite you to take a look inside with me as we share a little more about this outstanding building, the murals, and the work done to preserve the African house and conserve the work of Hunter contained in these walls.
Enslaved carpenters in the 1820s built this mushroom-shaped 2-story structure on Melrose Plantation, located on Cane River in northwest Louisiana. Built to be a barn, the building came to be known as African House. The Trust recognized African House in 2015 as a national treasure and furthered a successful campaign to restore the time-worn building threatened by destabilization. In 1955, the acclaimed artist Clementine Hunter painted a series of 9 large oil-on-plywood panels telling the story of the early 20th century life on Melrose Plantation, told from the point of view of the African American and Creole workers. The addition of African House murals enhanced the value of this remarkable structure. The murals were cleaned and conserved in 1984. But great strides in art conservation have been made since their only cleaning. After more than 30 years exposed to the dust and insects of Cane River, the murals desperately needed maintenance. Fine art conservators Jill Whitten and Robert Proctor came to the rescue with the tools and expertise necessary to accomplish this state-of-the-art conservation. They took the murals down and transported them to their Houston studio for months of extensive repair and conservation. After placing the panels in a nitrogen chamber to kill insects, the WP team cleaned and restored each square centimeter of the 9 panels. While the extensive conservation work on the African House murals was underway in Houston, a Hope crew, provided by the Trust, spent weeks at Melrose restoring African House. After a celebratory evening at the W&P studio, where the who's who of Houston art scene came to see Clementine Hunter's now bright and compelling paintings, Whitten and Proctor installed the panels for exhibition in Natchitoches, Louisiana, where they were on display for a year at the Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame and Northwest Louisiana History Museum. Jill Whitten and Robert Proctor returned to Louisiana in March 2016 to take down and return the paintings to Melrose, 15 miles south of Natchitoches. Over several days, the Whitten and Proctor team installed moisture barrier in African House and carefully placed each panel back where it was originally installed in 1955. Home at last. Clementine Hunter never traveled more than 100 miles from her Cane River home, but her famous murals of plantation life not only made the trip to Houston and back, but also spent 2 years away. Today, the artist's culturally significant African House murals hang once again on the 2nd floor of African House, open for all to see and enjoy.
Clementine painted up until 2 weeks before she died at the age of 101, passing in 1988. Hunter's work has been exhibited in most major American cities and was highlighted in an exhibit in the world-famous Paris Louvre. Further, an avant-garde opera was even made about her life, created by artist Robert Wilson, who claims Hunter as the inspiration for his exploration into art. Hunter's home and studio was named as a National Treasure or a National Trust Notable Historic Artist Homes and Studios site, and at present is the only woman of color on this list. We hope to see that change as the list grows. Lastly, as noted on the tour, Melrose was honored to be assisted by the National Treasures Program in 2015. In conjunction with the announcement, a massive preservation effort was undertaken by the Hope Crew, a trust initiative to bring hands-on preservation experience to a younger, more diverse audience. The project was a great success and ensured that Hunter's murals would have a safe place to call home for another 75 years. Hunter's work is celebrated throughout Melrose Plantation, which is located here in northern Louisiana, just outside the town of Natchitoches, and open to visitors year-round. You can learn more about the history of Melrose by visiting melroseplantation.org, and be sure while you're there to check out the hard work the Association for the Preservation of Historic Natchitoches continues to do to tirelessly be dutiful stewards of this outstanding site. Of note is that Melrose was adversely affected by both Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Delta, and as work on the grounds takes place, they're accepting donations at melroseplantation.org as well. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to share Melrose Plantation history with you and the wonderful work of Clementine.
Thanks, Molly. If anyone has any questions for Molly about Clementine Hunter or Melrose Plantation, please go ahead and type them in below. Molly, you mentioned Hurricane Laura and then Hurricane Delta, which I know were both really devastating for so many sites in the South. Can you say, and again, I mean, to be dealing with hurricanes on top of dealing with the pandemic has got to be just incredibly difficult. Can you say a bit more about how Melrose Plantation fared and how the recovery efforts there are going?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, it's been a rough year for Melrose. We were in the direct path of both hurricanes, and thankfully most of our buildings remained intact. We did have some roof damage, some fallen limbs, a lot of grounds maintenance that were required for cleanup. And we also, in addition to the time we were closed at the beginning of COVID, Melrose was also closed during that time period for cleanup. But they are up and running once again, and have tours Thursday through Sunday from 10 to 4. And definitely make reservations because there's limited numbers that can go on the guided portion, but there's also a lovely self-guided garden tour that allows you to socially distance and enjoy the beautiful setting that Melrose is located in.
Great. And Molly, I know that our tour today has focused more on Clementine Hunter, but I understand that there is much, much more to see at Melrose, and that Melrose Plantation actually has a long history associated with resilient women. Can you maybe just say a word or two about that?
Yes, absolutely. The legacy of important women that touch this site is outstanding. From Lou Metoyer's mother, Marie Therese Coin, who was an enslaved African woman who found her way out of slavery, and not only the 10 children she had with Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, but 5 children from another relationship were all, by the time she died, free and landowners on the Cane River. Additionally, the woman after that we touched on in the tour, Fanny Herzog, who had the first Freeman School on the Cane River, and Kemi Henry, who created an amazing artist retreat that inspired the work of Clementine that we got to view today. And then lastly, it was actually a women's nonprofit organization that took Melrose under their wing and have guided the preservation efforts, now more inclusive and going by the name of Association for the Preservation of Historic Natchitoches. Originally, it was a women's organization.
Ah, okay. Great. Well, Molly, we're all thinking about Melrose Plantation and really hoping for the best. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing a little bit about Melrose Plantation. We're going to be leaving Louisiana now and heading back north We're going up to Washington, D.C., and joining us to guide our visit to D.C. is Elizabeth Carter. Elizabeth is the executive director of the Woodrow Wilson House, which is one of the National Trust's historic sites. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. Elizabeth, I know that our final stop on the tour is just a little bit different than the other three, where because what you're going to share with us is actually an exhibit that you're doing at the house. Can you just maybe say a word or two about what people are going to be seeing in the video?
Sure, absolutely. We are the Woodrow Wilson House. It's the historic house, part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It was the house that Woodrow and Edith Wilson retired to when they left the White House in 1921. And it was built by Waddy Butler Wood, a historic site, and it is completely intact. In fact, my background here is the library. It's exactly as it was pretty much the day that Woodrow Wilson died. What you're going to see today is an exhibit that's outside in the garden. In Washington, D.C., we can't have people come inside, so we came up with the exhibit and it's all outside. You're going to see 19 flags for the 19th Amendment, and you'll see different flags in different sections depicting suffrage and how we interpreted the word suffrage outside.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let's go ahead and go and check out the tour.
Okay. Hello, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson House, a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. My name is Elizabeth Carter, and I'm the Executive Director. It's my pleasure to welcome you to see the suffrage outside, the 19th Amendment at 100 here at the Woodrow Wilson House. We started this exhibit this summer. It opened on September 10th, and I'm thrilled that we're able to be giving you a virtual tour this afternoon. It's a spectacular day. People ask me, how did it happen that you came upon a suffrage outside exhibit during a pandemic, and what inspired you? And so you'll see the pictures of the flags, and I have to say the inspiration came from a small project that we did at the outset of the pandemic. In April, when we were all confined to our homes, people got busy building victory gardens. And here at the Wilson House, we started a victory garden. We never had it before. We did a lot of research. I did a lot of research on putting one together. And we started to see this trend of images of Columbia that was used for plant the seeds of victory. And we decided we would compare the victory garden of 1918 to kitchen gardens of today that they have at the White House. And we started to do the research and see the history of Columbia was then, that personification of America was then used by the suffragists as well as many of their images that they used to portray the suffrage movement. Fast forward to May, we were asked to do an exhibition on suffrage outside, or suffrage at the Wilson House. We couldn't do it in the house, and so we looked to those flags and to the placards that we had in the front victory garden and thought, that's what suffragists did. They carried flags, they had banners, and they took their march outside. And so we did too. We put together some images that we came across mostly about Columbia. Started doing research on flags and images of Columbia, primarily from 1918 and the beginning of the war movement for America. And then as we dug a little deeper, we started to see a trend of how we could take those images and start this exhibition. As you go through the garden, you'll see we've divided it up into 6 different sections of what we mean by outside. We start with suffrage outside, women working outside the home. And then we move to women who are pushed outside the mainstream of the movement. You'll see some flags from the women who are protesting outside the White House. We have a whole section on women who are taking it outside to the streets. And this is when women are starting to wear different, their signs on their clothes. They're taking their politics and wearing it on their outside clothing, and they're starting to march and that's something that's new. We take it to women participating in World War I, and so they're working again outside the home for the war effort. And then finally, the last section takes us to women and our alliances outside the United States. And we talk about the different alliances we have with different countries where women had the right to vote before the American women. So with that, I'd like to highlight a few of the themes that I think are important, particularly for this conference and this where women made history. This is really important to us to demonstrate and illustrate how we came about putting this together. So we looked through a lot of images. Most of them are from the Library of Congress. We took the images and we thought, we can't just do black and whites outside on flags in the backyard. That wouldn't really tell a story. Our world is turned upside down. That's why we need to do an exhibition outside. We can't even do it inside the house. So we thought, let's take these images and take the original, which is black and white, and stretch it and morph it and change it by colorizing it to be a little bit more whimsical, to be something that's fun and beautiful to look at this garden. So that's how it started. We took the black and whites, we stretched them. They're very long on these canvases. The canvas is actually 3 feet wide by almost 9 feet tall. So some of them are a little pixelated, but we've come to realize that that brings the beauty to some of the images. The themes that we focused on are women working outside the home and the African American and immigrant and Asian women who were pushed outside the mainstream of the movement. And then once again, working outside the home of the working women who were working for the war effort. That evolution started from 1908 with Wilson, who had written a letter, and we've got an audio tape of it, of a reading of that letter, where he's saying women shouldn't have the right to vote. They don't have the experience they need to vote. They don't have any experience because they're not working outside the home. And should they have that experience, it would completely change the dynamic of the family. And that was his rationale for not having women have the right to vote. As the exhibition progresses, you'll see we do have a photograph of Woodrow Wilson. He is coming home from voting on October 19th, 1915, where he was voting in New Jersey for suffrage. He did believe that women should, by 1915, that women should have the right to vote. He votes for suffrage, but he doesn't believe it or feel that it should be a constitutional amendment. And that's why you then see them protesting outside the White House, saying, if you feel it in your heart that women should have the vote, then you need to make a constitutional amendment. By the time the war rolls around and women have contributed and sacrificed their husbands, brothers, fathers to the war, Woodrow Wilson then addresses in 1918 addresses Senate, and we also have a reading from that address stating, women have been our partners. They have sacrificed just as much, if not more, for this war effort. And so how can we not enfranchise them with the right to vote? And that was his appeal to Senate to make the constitutional amendment. The flags that I'd like to point out specifically are, which I think are captivating, is one in the section of where women are working outside the home. We have one image of Jeanette Rankin, and this is a colorized image. If you see the black and white, you see she's coming down the steps of Congress. There are two men standing up at the back. They're kind of looking like they're talking, maybe smoking, and she's walking down the steps. She's working outside the home in a job that is unusual for a woman at that time. And I think the picture is just remarkable and very telling of the time of what she's wearing and her movement. The next image that I think is rather beautiful is of Mary Terrell. I think that this black and white, which we specifically chose not to colorize, the photograph of an African-American woman in this particular picture, nor of the Mabel Lee. I think that this picture is ethereal and beautiful and just talks and shows the calmness and the dignity of this woman, and as well as the movement for women who were pushed outside the mainstream of the middle-class white woman's movement, and yet they fought with dignity and elegance. And you see that in that beautiful portrait of her. The next section that I think is interesting, and the flags I think also speak to this, women working outside the home, and tie together the two elements of women working outside the home, but also women being pushed outside the mainstream, are the two flags that demonstrate and illustrate women working during World War I. One is the stenographers and this lovely poster, which is a poster we got from the Library of Congress, and the other is the women of the Land Army. The women who were stenographers were traditionally during World War I were white women. Those were the jobs that white women were doing for the war effort. And by contrast to, although you see a white woman advertising to be part of the Land Army, it was actually African American women who were really supporting the Land Army and doing the more manual labor work. So I think that it's important to see those two posters next to one another, because it does speak to that theme of women working outside the home, but that difference of how it is for the women who were pushed outside the mainstream of the movement. So with that, people asked, how are you going to do this at the Woodrow Wilson House? And we have a beautiful historic garden. We're located in the heart of Kalorama, the house in Washington, D.C. The house was built at the early 1915, 1916. It was designed and built by Waddy Butler Wood, and he was a famous architect, many buildings across Washington, D.C. The garden that was built and designed by Waddy Butler Wood is exactly as it was 100 years ago, completely intact. And I look at that garden and thought, this is where this exhibition needs to take place. It's outside, that's where the women took their fight, they brought their flags outside, they marched outside, and so we thought no better place than the Woodrow Wilson House rear garden. The exhibit is completely 100% COVID safe in that you book online, we have timed entry, you do not enter the house to see the exhibit, you come through the garage. We have sanitizers located throughout the exhibit. We do have a restroom that's open for our visitors, as well as our gift shop, but the rest of the house is closed for the remainder until Phase 2 is over in Washington, D.C. With that, if you'd like to book your tickets, you can go to woodrowwilsonhouse.org online and reserve your spot. And it would be my pleasure to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson House to see Suffrage Outside, the 19th Amendment at 100.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for that virtual tour of Suffrage Outside. If anybody has any questions for Elizabeth, please do put them in the chat down below. Elizabeth, for visitors who are coming to DC who might want to experience this in person, remind us again how long this exhibit is going to be open.
Yes, we are open until through Thanksgiving weekend. So we're open every day. It will be free on Tuesdays, extended hours on Thursdays, where it's very popular on the weekends. So book your tickets online.
Fantastic. And then what's next? What's going to be coming after Suffrage Outside?
Well, you can see we've got this beautiful garden, and it's in the heart of Washington, and we're thinking about what the exhibit will be in the spring. We're looking at concept of what is progressive? What are progressives? Who are progressives? And Woodrow Wilson recognized the progressive of today. So with the election coming around, this is a pretty hot topic in Washington, D.C. And so we're thinking of doing that outside in the garden in the spring.
Oh, very appropriate, very appropriate. Well, at this point, I'd love to invite all the panelists to come and join me again. I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight and for all of your hard work in putting together these virtual experiences. Hopefully we've been able to get to many of your questions that you might have had in the chat, and I hope that many of you in the audience will have a chance to sometime in the near future be able to visit these sites in person. Washington, D.C. is the perfect place for us to be winding up our virtual tour tonight as we're celebrating places where women made history. It's especially appropriate because in the fall of next year, November 2021, the PastForward conference will be taking place in D.C. So you'll have a chance to go to the Woodrow Wilson House in person if you'd like back then. Between now and then, I know that we're all looking forward to hopefully finding a vaccine or a cure, or ideally both, and being able to resume our in-person lives once again. But in the meantime, please stay safe. We hope to see all of you in person in DC at PastForward next year. Please enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for taking time to join us for our cross-country virtual tour where women made history coast to coast. Thank you.